All right. Well, I see our numbers are continuing to grow. So as folks are joining, I will continue to extend a very warm welcome. My name is Priya Bala-Miller, and I'm the Managing Director of the Nature Investment Hub. And we are a solution space of Generate Canada in partnership with the Smart Prosperity Institute. On behalf of the Hub and the remarkable team behind First 30 by 30 Canada, I'd like to thank you for tuning into this webinar on scaling investment in Indigenous-led conservation across Canada. For those of you who might be new to the Hub, we are focused on the very ambitious goal to close the nature finance gap. And a core value in our work is recognizing that our Indigenous brothers and sisters are already leading in this space, and that centering this perspective with reciprocity and respect is also an invitation for deep listening. Listening with our head and hearts so that our hands can join in the heavy lifting needed for nature finance. So deep listening also starts with grounding ourselves, bringing an embodied awareness to how we are arriving as a collective today. We have a huge number of folks registered, so we're delighted that you're joining us. And in asking you to bring that embodied awareness to how we're showing up as a collective today, I recognize that I'm joining as an immigrant woman of color with ancestral roots in South India, where the Bay of Bengal, Indian Ocean, and Arabian Sea meet. So it is with a shared but differentiated lived experience of coloniality that I'm also very deeply grateful to be joining you on this webinar from the shared, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, also known as Vancouver. These lands hold immense ecological, cultural, and spiritual value to the nations who steward them, as has been the case from coast to coast to coast. And as I invite my colleague Courtney Kehoe, the Hub's Director of Partner Engagement, in to guide the remainder of today's discussion, I also invite each of you to please consider the lands upon which you live and work, and the diverse cultures, languages, laws, protocols, traditions, and beliefs of the Indigenous people who are hosting us. As a collective, we must go further by pairing acknowledgement with meaningful action, by building partnerships, amplifying Indigenous voices, and as we're here to discuss today, the very important goal of aligning financial resources to advance reconciliation and better outcomes for nature. So with that, I warmly invite my colleague Courtney Kehoe to lead us on. And thank you very much again for tuning in today. Courtney, over to you.
Thanks so much, Priya. I am so pleased to be here today holding the space for this critical conversation and joining you from the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory here in Ottawa. Our conversation today is centered around how Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship activities can be funded and financed at scale, with a specific focus on the role of philanthropy and the private sector. We welcome those who are already investing and looking to deepen their impact, as well as newcomers exploring the space and opportunities to get involved. Over the next 90 minutes, we will first invite Stephen Nita to expand on our collective understanding and appreciation for Indigenous-led conservation in Canada. Jeffrey Brown will then introduce First 30 by 30 Canada and touch on their role in connecting Indigenous-led opportunities to investment capital. We will then hear from 4 guest speakers about the role of philanthropic and private sectors in enabling this work before closing with some closing remarks. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with registrants and posted on Nature Investment Hub and First 30 by 30 websites following the event. Although there will not be a Q&A session today live, you are still welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in any questions that surface throughout the conversation today. We will do our best to collect and compile responses to as many of these as possible, including those submitted during registration, and share back in a follow-up email to you. With that, let me introduce and hand it over to Stephen Nita. So Stephen is the Managing Director of Nature for Justice's work in Canada and is leading the First 30 by 30 program. I suspect he will be known to many as he has been at the forefront of Canada's Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, IPCA, and Indigenous-led conservation movement for decades. As a result, there's certainly so much more I could say about Stephen, but in the interest of time, I will invite those on the line to refer to the document in the chat, which provides a short bio for Stephen, as well as our other speakers that you hear from today. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Priya, and thank you to Nature Investment Hub for hosting this webinar. I invite all that are participating to join the effort in supporting Indigenous-led conservation that can support Canada to reach its international commitments under the Montreal Command Framework of protecting 30% terrestrially and 30% of the oceans. You know, as my friend Leroy Little Bear once told me, if it was just Indigenous people in this world, we won't need any national parks or any protected areas. Alas, we are in a different space today, and nature is the 1/3 solution to climate change, and obviously you cannot have biodiversity without nature. Canada plays an important role in our global collective efforts in addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. We are the second largest country in the world. If we look at Canada as an ecosystem, everybody and everything on Earth benefits from the ecoservices of what is Canada today. The Indigenous-led conservation initiatives, Indigenous leadership in conservation has always been there, but not formally participating in the processes of creating, protecting, conserved areas until the last decade or so. I was a member of the Indigenous Circle of Experts that were mandated to engage with Indigenous peoples and governments in Canada, and starting in 2017. The Indigenous Circle of Experts were 11 representatives of Indigenous governments from coast to coast to coast, with 9 representatives of the Canadian public government's bureaucracy from the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. In 1 year, we had 4 regional gatherings and 2 national gatherings, asking the simple question. Canada is committed to protecting 17%, which was under the AG Accord at the time, and would like to work with Indigenous governments and peoples to use some of their territories to meet that international commitment. What type of relationships would you like to have with public governments for some of your territories to be used to meet Canada's international commitments? That's the question we asked in these 4 regional gatherings and 2 national gatherings. The results and what we've heard was documented in that report, We Rise Together, with 27 recommendations. That report has really taken off. It's been used by Indigenous governments, public governments, people working in conservation here in Canada and around the world. And it's been a useful guide in getting us to where we are today. Today, you know, Indigenous peoples are supported through networks such as the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, which I helped create and lead today, which is a partnership of over 500 organizations, peoples, to support the implementation of the 27 recommendations contained in the Indigenous Circle of Experts report, We Rise Together. That effort resulted in what we're calling the knowledge basket that has over 700 pieces of knowledge in there now on how to create Indigenous protect and conserve areas, best practices, etc., etc. That's available to all Indigenous governments, public governments, and their allies to use to create Indigenous protect and conserved areas. I myself had led my nation to create one of the largest Indigenous protected areas in the world. We protected 26,367 square kilometers in the Northwest Territories in partnership with Parks Canada and the government of Northwest Territories. That protected area is called Thai-Dinangene. It's been recognized by the United Nations at two levels. One was the community and leadership was recognized for the efforts and work that we put into dismantling colonial policies to come to agreements that we can live with. And just recently this year at COP 16 in Colombia, Sayulita is one of 20 case studies that the United Nations put out there as an example of how public and Indigenous governments can work together to create protected and conserved areas. Indigenous peoples certainly has picked up the mantle of the challenge of using nature and supporting nature to provide the 1/3 solution to climate change and prevent total loss of biodiversity. There's over 70 Indigenous protected and conserved areas declared across the country to date. The challenge is that Canada is not a populated area. We do not have the tax base to effectively create and manage 30% of our protected areas within terrestrial lands and or the marine conservation areas. Hence the need for all hands on deck to support the efforts of Indigenous peoples, the efforts of many organizations, including many on the call today, to realize the financial capacity required to not only protect 30%, but to manage that 30% against the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. Sayulita, for an example, we are partners with Parks Canada that has a tax base of Canada. We are partners with the government of Northwest Territories that has a tax base of the people of Northwest Territories. And we were able to negotiate a $30 million trust that my people use to fulfill our end of the responsibilities. Yet the parties to these agreements, these three governmental organizations, have a let it burn policy within Sayulita because we don't have the financial resources to fight the fires. So, protecting 30% is not good enough anymore. We need to be able to manage that 30%. And Canada being such a critical eco services to the global community, we want to invite the global community, philanthropy, corporations and businesses to support the efforts here in Canada and around the world. To that end, we've worked diligently in creating the 30 by 30 program to connect the Indigenous governments that are advancing their protected or conserved areas within their territories with philanthropy, with corporate world, and to the marketplace. For that, I'd like to ask Jeffrey to speak to the 30 by 30 program. Jeffrey?
Thanks, Stephen. My name is Jeffrey Brown. I acknowledge that the land on which I was raised, the Adirondack region of New York, is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, including the Mohawk Nation. I'm the co-founder and chief development officer of Nature Focus, a global nature-based solutions developer supporting Indigenous-led conservation and rural community projects around the world. The first 30 by 30 program is built with the pillars of three organizations: Nature for Justice, an organization that's been supporting community justice efforts around the world for decades, a mixture of combination of experience with Conservation International, Greenpeace, Stephen Neats's leadership, amongst many others. Our Canadian nonprofit partner, the Isak Olam Foundation, located in Vancouver Island, supporting nations across Canada on IPCA and capacity building, and our organization, Nature Focus. The first 30 by 30's cornerstone partner we're thankful for is the Royal Bank of Canada through the Tech for Nature Foundation. Next slide. So why we created the first 30 by 30? It was created because it has a unique opportunity to sit in the middle of three major movements: national goals to combat the impacts of climate change, global corporate net zero commitments, and Indigenous reconciliation. A small minority of the global population is Indigenous, but a vast majority of the world's biodiversity lives within that land base. Understanding these global converging factors, as well as the critical needs of Indigenous lands, the first 30 by 30 is designed to sit at the center, putting Indigenous peoples in the lead for the achievement of these national goals, working with global capital and corporates, support that goes beyond these traditional borders. The program focuses on supporting a nation-led movement for IPCAs across the country, developing high integrity and high impact nature-based solution projects to support those IPCA goals, and ensuring that nations get fair, transparent, and beneficial contracts. The first 30 by 30 can have major eco impacts. We can build long-term economic development engines based on the necessary ecological stewardship of those land bases. Next slide. So like many early ventures, there can be a funding valley of death. Now, we believe that the first 30 by 30 model can be a bridge over that valley, leading to a mountain of impact opportunities. By engaging the philanthropic audience, we can collectively mobilize resources to create an exponentially greater impact. Projects require upfront and traditionally costly capital to engage nations, to identify the key technical and legal aspects of potential projects, and to start to navigate the pathways to the market. Our team and global resources assist in assessing the stage of readiness for our nation's project, supporting it with structure and process development. The first 30 by 30 pools capital with a purpose to support Indigenous-led opportunities through the initial steps of a project. The goal is to identify which nations have viable projects for not only today, but ones that can also meet future market needs, and driving efforts to multiple project milestones. Completing the feasibility study stage gives the nation the opportunity to continue the project and engage with larger global nature finance funds, institutional capital sources, and leading corporates for advanced market commitments. Leading finance experts estimate that the carbon market in just 5 years could have a global value of over $35 billion. These projections underscore the importance of market integrity and demand shaping the market's future value. Corporate net zero commitments are pivotal in driving the expansion of these carbon markets. As companies seek to offset emissions they cannot eliminate internally. Now, this surge in demand for carbon credits incentivizes investments in projects that reduce or remove greenhouse gases, and thereby enhancing the scale and liquidity of carbon markets. These commitments help not only lower future finance risk for Indigenous projects, but they also set the framework for year-over-year revenue expectations, building an economic engine for the nation. Next slide. Now, as we boldly go where no program has gone before, we are building a model to scale that blends the key sources of capital to develop projects that in return will have multiple impactful outcomes. As the economic engine of nation-based solution project turns, the nation has an opportunity to increase climate resiliency with carbon sequestration management practices and biodiversity protection, build food sovereignty strategies, improving both cultural connection and healthcare outcomes, establish jobs and skills resources through the creation of community-led guardian programs, and invest in their own energy needs, lowering risk from future energy pricing challenges. Carbon can be a catalyst for change. The key resource sits within the lands that we have lost a connection to, hence the current crisis we're in. This catalyst can not only rebuild that connection, but create a strong future for Indigenous nations across Canada. Next slide. So what lies ahead in 2025? At COP29, significant progress was made in enabling Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which establishes frameworks for international carbon markets. This development holds particular relevance for Canada, given its active participation in global climate initiatives and its commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. With the activation of Article 6, Canada can engage more effectively in international carbon markets, allowing for the exchange of carbon credits to meet its nationally determined contributions. The establishment of clear rules and standards under Article 6 is expected to boost confidence amongst investors and could lead to increased funding for carbon reduction projects. The inclusion of safeguards ensures that the carbon market activities respects the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Canada's commitment to these principles aligns with its domestic policies, promoting reconciliation and inclusive climate action. Our team has extensive experience as well as best-in-class resources for well-developed methodologies such as improved forest management, sustainable grassland and rangeland management, sustainable agricultural land management, and nature stewardship credits, which focuses on remote areas and the critical needs of the communities and vital at-risk biodiversity that call those lands home. Our impacts are spread currently across the country, working in the old-growth temperate rainforest of British Columbia, supporting nations in the government and landscape nature strategies in the Northwest Territories, all the way down to the breadbasket of the prairies of Saskatchewan, and even engaging in critical forest and wetland habitats of Quebec. Our program has caught the attention of dozens of nations who are on their journey. Our team is in various stages of the process, meeting currently 10+ nations and supporting their next steps into 2025. Our mission has been and will be to inspire hearts, minds, and funding for proven quote-unquote last mile solutions. But our focus here today begins at the first mile, starting this epic journey and staying the course. With less than 2% of North American philanthropic money directed towards climate action, we bridge philanthropy, science, and Indigenous values to clarify the crisis and align your passions with the most impactful ways to drive change. I thank you for your time today. You have an amazing panel coming up, and I'll pass it over to Courtney Keogh.
Thank you, Stephen and Jeffrey, for grounding us in that context and orienting everyone on this call to the opportunities that First 30 by 30 intends to help open up as an important intermediary in Canada. Building on this, we are incredibly grateful to have a really impressive group of speakers with us today to unpack the role of philanthropy and the private sector in scaling Indigenous-led conservation. Each of them brings unique experiences and perspectives that will surely inspire, challenge, and expand our collective thinking. And we have with us Samantha White-Eye, Director of the Indigenous Leadership Pillar at Carolinian Canada and co-lead for the Conservation Impact Bond, Thea Silver, Senior Director, Environmental Impact at RBC, Carolyn Beatty, Executive Director of the Sitka Foundation, and Adam Spence, CEO, co-founder, and director at SVX. And as I invite each of them to come on screen, just before we kick off this conversation, I do want to note that while we have invited these philanthropic and private leaders to speak to their role in scaling investment, governments also have a really important role to play as well, including through financial support for capacity building for project development, as well as participating in blending finance models and other de-risking strategies that help crowd in non-public funding sources. And so to get us started, I would like to ask each of our speakers to maybe take about 1 to 2 minutes to briefly introduce yourselves and how your organization is investing in or helping to scale investment in Indigenous-led conservation across Canada. And I might invite Sam to go first, followed by Adam, Thea, and then Carolyn, please. Oh, and Sam, I think you will just have to come off mute. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Nida Shinzi, Howe Shopako, ni nonjie lapawi lakawi, ni naungwamawa ktakwa, ni ndolanapawi. So hello, everyone. I'm the Indigenous Leadership Director with Carolinian Canada. And as Courtney mentioned, I'm co-lead for the Conservation Impact Bond. So basically, it's a pay-for-success blended finance mechanism driven by co-creation and collaboration for healthy landscapes. This model ties together, impact finance, conservation, the economy of native plants, and Indigenous leadership and goals. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sam. And thanks so much, Courtney, and the team at the Nature Investment Hub for the opportunity to join you today. So I'm Adam Spence, CEO and Director of SVX. Want to first acknowledge the land I live and work on is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So at SVX, our role, we act as an advisor for enterprises, organizations, investors, governments, funds, and institutions, including Indigenous-led organizations. And our role is really helping folks take the first or the next step on their impact investing journey. So designing particular products or strategies that would, in many cases, advance Indigenous ownership, conservation aims, and connecting those two pieces together, as well as supporting in other areas, including food systems, housing, and beyond. So really excited about this conversation, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Adam. I think that's me. And I'd also like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm situated, which I believe, Adam, are the same as where you may be calling in from. I'm calling in from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Chippewa, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. Nice to be here with everyone. My name is Thea Silver, and I am the Senior Director of Environmental Impact at RBC, as Courtney mentioned. It's a relatively new role for me. I've been in role about 9 months, where I'm responsible for leading RBC's environmental philanthropy across both the enterprise-wide and through the RBC Foundation. And we'll speak to more of this as the conversation goes on, but at a high level, as I think Stephen or Jeffrey referenced, RBC was the first funder at the early stages of First 30 by 30 to help move the initiative forward. And that was through our Tech for Nature program. And through that program, we had provided some smaller support to some Indigenous-led initiatives. I learned that we had supported, for example, some coastal restoration work through the Pakwachin First Nation. And in a more distant past, it actually contributed to the Great Bear Rainforest. But it's a relatively new area for us as a funder and has been ad hoc. And I'll speak as we go on to our more recently launched approach to community investment that includes a more explicit centering of Indigenous-led work to advance nature-based solutions. So great to be joining everyone here today.
Thanks, Thea. My name's Carolyn. My pronouns are she, her, and I also am calling in and wanted to acknowledge the shared territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations here where I live. My ancestry is from Northern Europe, and I am really lucky to work for the Sitka Foundation, which has a goal to support biodiversity and conservation, which is defined in a very broad way. We've been learning a lot recently about how to activate our full spectrum of capital towards mission alignment. And through our philanthropic capital have been playing a role. We're invited to support Indigenous-led conservation. More recently, that's looked like how do we show up regarding some of the really interesting and exciting project finance for permanence initiatives across North America or across Canada. But we also support a lot of nations and communities here in what's known as British Columbia to further Indigenous-led conservation. And yeah, I'll dig into a little bit more of what that looks like later on in this panel.
Thank you all for that. Sam, I would love it if you could just take a few moments to recenter us on the why. If you could elaborate on the goals of scaling up the Conservation Impact Bond as one, mechanism for bringing in different types of financing, and particularly how its financing creates opportunities to support Indigenous economic reconciliation.
Yes. So to center us in a place-based location, the Conservation Impact Bond is located in the territories of Deshkanizibi, the Haudenosaunee, and the Lenape peoples across the Carolinian zone. So I think, though, that this model is a lot more complex on why Carolinian Canada chose to do it this way. And I think, as Stephen and others have kind of prefaced that, if we look at conservation in general, and at least for the lifespan of Carolinian Canada, it's roughly 40 years, we realize that, we're still losing species and biodiversity. And experiencing habitat loss. And so we realized that traditional conservation wasn't working. However, looking around, Indigenous communities today steward some of the most ecologically intact and biodiverse lands in Canada alone. And that's covered by 35% of modern treaties. And so, Indigenous knowledge and the stories out there on the lands were often left out of, many of the conversations in regards to conservation by all levels of government and beyond. And this was something that Carolyn Canada, we couldn't ignore, and things are changing now. But we realized that this was a missing piece that the sector needed. And so we centered our why around co-creation. How could we create a new model and way of doing things that empowers Indigenous stewards, challenges the inequities that communities face in trying to achieve their goals around conservation, and support their autonomy of the financial decisions to carry out the work. So we centered this model around, so I think in terms of the Deshkanzibi, we worked really closely with Chippewa of the Thames and leaders to develop the CIB. And the outcomes of the model from an Indigenous perspective are both qualitative and quantitative. I think when we look at the impact, sometimes it can be black and white, for instance. For scaling this model, the goal is 400 hectares restored. But for Indigenous communities, it goes a lot deeper than that. When I visit with the Indigenous communities and the nations in Southern Ontario, I ask them, what are the goals for the land? And they'll tell me, some examples are creating land-based learning opportunities and guardian programs. Others, it's land protection and restoration of prairies and forests, food sovereignty, water testing and work along riparian zones, mapping, GIS, cultural burning, etc. And so if we take all these goals and turn them into flexible outcomes to capture and support Indigenous nations where they need it most, this is what we really wanted to do. And so we created, kind of a two-eyed seeing evaluation framework with diversified metrics. And through that, we were able to measure and collect the data to showcase the stories of impact and the outcomes from each model. So, and also I want to center to that, Chippewas of the Thames really advocated for both qualitative and quantitative metrics. And I'm glad that they did, because if you only look at hectares restored, then I feel like you're missing out on the true impact for Indigenous stewards and our habitat partners when it comes to outcomes. And so for scaling these outcomes, they're going to be key, because we can take the data and numbers and be able to tie it to financial and economic figures. This is what we hope to do for phase 3 of the model. And so in this way, this can directly speak to economic reconciliation. And some examples from, Deshkanzibi phase 1 and Long Point phase 2 would be, business growth and development, capacity building and job creation, support for social enterprises in the field of conservation, and, building a green economy with native plants and Indigenous growers. So, Carolinian Canada is scaling up the CIB across the Carolinian zone. And so what this means in terms of opportunities for Indigenous communities and partners is a diversified habitat portfolio where outcome payers can invest in more than one outcome if they choose to. This creates room for Indigenous communities to dream up projects, big or small, and receive the full support they need to do the work on the land in the ways that make sense for them. And that's all I could want.
Thanks so much for that, Sam. And I love it. And I love that you've kind of centered the opportunity to go beyond, how we currently sometimes value nature-based activities in terms of restoration and ecosystem outcomes, and broadening that scope to articulate some of the other outcomes and values that we need to be centering in our conversations and in our opportunities to invest in these critical activities. Adam, maybe I will turn to you. I know that SVX has been involved in the Conservation Impact Bond, and I wondered, part of our purpose for coming here together today is to help our audience understand at which stages they might be able to get involved and financially support Indigenous conservation and stewardship activities. And I think Jeffrey presented that nice spectrum of the different financial stages at which someone could get involved. Wondering if, drawing from your experience, you could share an example or two of Indigenous-led conservation finance initiatives that SVX has been involved in, and if you could explain why you engaged at the specific stage you did and how that approach proved impactful, that would be really helpful to hear. Thanks.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think we work with a number of Indigenous-led conservation initiatives, including the Carolinian Canada Bond and another one, the White Feather Forest Initiative. And I had the good fortune of hearing from Sam, and today, let me talk a bit about this other example. And so White Feather Forest Initiative, it's based in the Boreal in Northwestern Ontario, in an area about the size of Connecticut, and it's owned by a Pikangikum First Nation. They own and have secured the first sustainable forest license owned by a First Nation in Canada. They're about 750 or so kilometers away or northwest of Thunder Bay. And so they wanted to be able to create a blended financing strategy to capitalize an enterprise that would sustainably harvest, conserve, protect, and leverage and utilize the resources to create and sell a value-added wood products. And so not a clear-cutting approach, but one that applies two-eyed seeing and Indigenous practice of harvesting the forest in a sustainable and conservation mindful approach. And so they wanted to be able to create wealth for the community, as well as opportunities for training, jobs, and even long-term assets for the community and its inhabitants. And they spent well over a decade developing this particular project. And we walked alongside them in similar steps as were identified by Jeffrey. So beginning with some groundwork, where they were able to establish the vision and direction for the organization, then a discovery, design, and deployment. And so a bit of a similar path. So how we typically get involved is kind of following that first phase. So once the vision has been established, the ownership and leadership, then we can provide support in terms of the research and design of these innovative financing tools and strategies. And we try to follow a set of principles and practices. These are still emergent. And again, they're coming from the perspective of an ally and an organization, ours, that's still in the process of learning, and it's imperfect. And so I'll just maybe highlight that, but maybe share a few ways that we see this. One is ensuring that we're following and combining both two-eyed seeing as well as Western approaches to the doing as well as management of these particular strategies. We also want to ensure, second, that there's Indigenous governance and representation, that there is a formal engagement as decision makers, not only as stakeholders to be consulted or to advise processes or practices, but actually representing and governing the practices and processes that we take. There's also some form of third, Indigenous ownership related to these particular activities. In the case of Whitefeather, the initiative is owned by the First Nation itself. Ensuring as well there's direction and control of programs and assets. We see that within the context of the Carolinian Canada Conservation Impact Bond in terms of the activities that are delivered by the many First Nations partners. There's also individual and institutional engagement by Indigenous persons, as well as formal organizations. And then finally, it's a non-extractive approach. And this doesn't mean there are no returns, but it does mean that we're not trying to pull all the entirety of the value out of it in a colonial or traditional way. And so those are some of the practices or principles we try to follow. And I maybe just add at the end, and want to be brief, this is one example. There's many others around the world, particularly of nations that are investing their own assets into conservation. In Canada, the United States, and New Zealand, that are advancing conservation, nation building, and economic development. I'll maybe pop a few links in the chat, but MLTC in Saskatchewan, Alaska in the United States, and the Guy Tahu Holdings in New Zealand. So many examples we can see, learn, and observe, and then bring back to our own practices.
Thanks for that, Adam. And I really appreciate the framing of, these are the principles that we kind of carry into these relationships that are really relationships that you nourish over time. And Sam, I know you and I have talked about that quite a bit in our past conversations. Carolyn, I'm wondering if I can bring you in. You noted some examples of activities that Sitka Foundation is involved in out on the West Coast. Wondering if you might be able to speak to one or two of those to help illustrate the role that philanthropy can play in scaling investment in Indigenous-led conservation.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I would probably start with a little story that we've been funding marine conservation and marine spatial planning, community-led organizing, comms and engagement for quite a long time, but in a bit of an ad hoc way here on the south, but mostly central and north coasts of what's known as British Columbia, we were invited a couple of years ago to be part of the Great Bear Sea PFP. PFPs are really interesting because as a vehicle for conservation finance, a lot of the work happens beforehand, and then the agreements are signed, and then, of course, the work continues, but in a bit of a different form. And that signing date, that concept of a single close, borrows from, as I'll drop in the chat later, Wall Street, but is done in a really community-directed way and a really collaborative way to involve public and private partnerships. So funding from philanthropy and funding from governments, and done in an Indigenous-led way. So we have financing, governance, policy, law, capacity, communications, and durability. The Great Bear Sea PFP closed in June of this year, and we were really honored to have been invited in to join at the more, I say, like relationship-based and mechanical way a few years ago, which shifted how our philanthropy showed up from a bit more of an ad hoc and disparate way to a much more concise and at the direction of the Indigenous leaders from coastal First Nations and non-localist councils. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing, and it won't be, but it was really a relationship-based process, and I think that was my big takeaway also, that the Great Bear Sea PFP built on the vision and the legacy of the Great Bear Rainforest, but was done in 2024, and I'm sure what these will look like in the future will look, again, completely differently. In a minute, I'll drop a really interesting report by Coast Funds, culminating, or that reflected on the impact of the Great Bear Rainforest in place-based economic health. 1,252 jobs directly connected to the Great Bear Rainforest, and a projected amount that's even higher for the Great Bear Sea. That ties a little bit into what Adam was just talking about, so that we have a really strong understanding of durability across all sorts of people who are living in these really important ecosystems and places. In November of this year, the Northwest Territories PFP also closed, and we were less involved in an active way, but 375 million of the public-private funding was part of that initiative, and 22 Indigenous governments and the government of the Northwest Territories and the government of Canada all contributed a lot of capacity towards that. We're learning a lot. I'm going to drop in a minute really valuable resource from the Circle on Philanthropy that shares a little bit about the how a funder partner can show up and learn at the direction, or as Christine Smith-Martin would say, from coastal First Nations, like walking alongside the other folks who are holding accountability and holding a long-term role in the community. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the way that we've been showing up has also hopefully been contributing to a shift in power, and activating other kinds of capital. Philanthropic capital is an important one, but social capital is the one that I'm currently talking about. And as I think we'll dig into, there's a few other types of capital that I think can be really helpful. So I guess in summary, the PFPs are two examples of how Indigenous-led conservation has been something that we've been involved in, but we also have specific other initiatives connected to more what Elsa Stephen was talking about earlier, and Jeffrey, regarding what other IPCAs can look like, which doesn't have to be the PFP model. There is no one way to, I think, see support across I guess, a broad way of doing things, or a certain way of a framework. We really take everything in a relational, unique kind of way.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I'm sure everyone is excited to receive all of those resources that you will drop into the chat. And I really appreciate how the conversation is evolving to show that there Carolyn, to your point, that there's not just one financial instrument that folks can help design and create and finance. There are this, a widespread spectrum of opportunities, and from the Conservation Impact Bond to PFPs to other mechanisms that can be used within a territory. Thea, I'll bring you in because I know you mentioned and teased, RBC is an investor or a funder of First 30 by 30. But when you came in to lead the environmental philanthropy portfolio at RBC, that decision was already made. But I'm wondering if you might be able to share some insights on what made that attractive. And were there any particular considerations or aspects that came into play from a corporate perspective when exploring the opportunity to fund First 30 by 30 and everything that goes behind it?
Sure, thanks, Courtney. And I had to do a little bit of digging myself to learn. And you're right, I was actually pleasantly surprised when I joined RBC to learn that we had made an initial 1-year grant early in the development of First 30 by 30 to help launch it. I think that was back in the fall of 2023, so probably about 6 months before I arrived. And my understanding was that the First 30 by 30 was actually looking for a major, potentially institutional partner to help get the initiative off the ground. And I think Jeffrey, correct me if I'm wrong, had a connection with the individual who had previously led our Tech for Nature program, who had coincidentally moved to head up our environmental market solution group, which kind of oversees our engagement in carbon projects. And I think it was actually the carbon potential that initially piqued our interest and his interest, but it soon became clear, and sort of reflecting on Jeffrey's chart showing the phases of funding, it became clear that the carbon potential was a longer term opportunity, and that the short term shorter or immediate need was more on the philanthropy to help really catalyze the project. And that provide that support that it needed as it evolved to a place of other investments and carbon offtake and those types of opportunities to continue to finance. So that's sort of how it came to us. I don't think beyond that, I don't think there were necessarily specific corporate considerations that came into play. I think there were more questions that a funder might have with any potential proposal that was new, because it was a new initiative here in Canada with a new partner new to us. So there was a learning curve, but I think we quickly recognized the importance of the initiative from a national perspective, the credibility of the organizations and the people involved, which at the initial stage did include a longtime partner of RBC's, which was helpful to socialize it. And I think we recognized the community-centered approach and the myriad of outcomes that could be achieved, sort of speaking to what Sam spoke about earlier, about diversified outcomes and diversified metrics. And I think we appreciated that holistic approach. And there was a lot of support for getting involved. It did take a little bit of creativity on our part because, interestingly, even though Stephen was leading it here in Canada, the entity that was helping to lead it, Nature for Justice, was a US-based organization that can be tricky for us to fund through our Canadian mechanisms. But we found a way to do that and to direct that funding there, and have sort of trusted the leadership ever since through both an initial grant and a subsequent 2-year renewal. And I think we also hope that being one of the first big funders in and providing that early funding, that would provide an opportunity to help catalyze and bring others to the table as it moved forward. And on that, I think our experience with that, and also in looking at how we engage in other early stage projects right across the board, regardless of who is leading them, but our approach to early stage funding, I think that's informed our thinking around our new approach to community investment, which was launched at the end of October. So right across our funding areas now, we've recognized that communities need support for sort of different purposes at different times. So we've considered projects at various stages of development, and we have funding for seed projects that are in that formative early feasibility development stage. And with that, we can still make a multi-year like up to 2 years and a significant investment. I think it's up to $500,000 a year or something for a couple years. But we have the flexibility to actually fund 100% of a project for that part, recognizing that it takes time to get others to come in. Then we're able to fund for another number of years to help scale and grow the project, and finally to help sustain it with our funding potentially, and I'm talking philanthropic funding here, potentially being less as the project matures, but it's a mechanism for us to, where warranted, be in relationship and help advance, and support something for close to a decade. And from the environmental space specifically, through our new investment strategy, we've moved away from sort of our tech for nature focus, which centered tech, to a broader kind of ambition and focus around climate mitigation solutions and nature-based solutions. And in that, a clear acknowledgement of leadership of Indigenous people and an interest in really wanting to advance that work where we are invited to do so.
Thanks, Thea, for that. I see Jeffrey came back onto screen. I think he might have a response to your contribution. So Jeffrey, I will open it up to you.
Yeah, just briefly, again, we are thankful for RBC's commitment on going on this journey with us and understanding that, as there's this growing level of pressure around the utilization of different climate tools, how do we ensure that nations, communities around the world, but in focus of Canada here, are getting the things that they need, not only for the understanding of what pathways that they have, but also in addition to ensure that they're getting the majority of the benefits of a project. From our own personal experience working down in Mexico with the Ejido communities in the Yucatan Peninsula with Mayan peoples, or the Tarahumara communities in the northern states of Chihuahua and Durango, we had seen that many communities were being offered the opportunity, but not getting the majority of the benefits. And that started to become clear to us that that wasn't just exclusive to Mexico, that was also potentially in Canada and other parts of the world. Our partnership with Nature for Justice actually helps us build that community trust, understanding what those nations need, and then build out programs that are not just about identifying a revenue generation for today, but actually using that as the foundation that they need for tomorrow, whether it's their solar power energy needs, whether it's healthcare access, working with groups like Red Cross, or supporting their housing and education needs. These are the sort of things that our programs can be well positioned to do. And more importantly, by engaging philanthropic capital and being able to capture the charitable purpose and focus that they have, we have the opportunity to really put that money to work in an exponential impact strategy where it can be something that becomes a revenue generator for long-term outcomes for a nation. And we can continue to shift that balance of philanthropic capital to other places that need it. This is a global evolving landscape. The challenges of climate change are evolving, and we have to be very fluid in regards to how we're going to engage in the tools that we're going to supply nations across the planet on these really critical challenges that they're facing.
Thanks for that, Jeffrey. And also, I loved that ability to talk about seeding, sustaining, and scaling. And through that, there is certainly opportunity for philanthropy to be involved, corporate philanthropy, impact investors, pension funds. It's kind of captures the whole suite of opportunity. And Sam, I'd love to bring you back in, because a common thread that I'm hearing through all of this is this importance of relationship in building and designing and implementing these different conservation finance instruments. And we know that sometimes that can be complex, but it is integral, and especially when we're talking about Indigenous-led opportunities. And so based on your experience with the Conservation Impact Bond, I'm just curious to know if there are certain factors or criteria that guide the process of engaging funders and investors, or if there's any strategies for funders or investors on the line that you would recommend for meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities.
Yes, great question. So for Carolina Canada, this was an involving process for us because, we had to really think about how do you weave in values corporate responsibility, accountability that is also in line with Indigenous values and worldviews in relation to the land. And Michelle Cantor, she always talks about how in phase one, it was a handshake agreement first with formal agreements that followed after the co-creation phase. But in phase two, that's when this question really became necessary to look at, because with the success of phase one, we had requests from certain investors that wanted to approach us, and the leadership team, they were really unsure about it. So we convened and had to talk about it, and we had to have some really hard conversations. We had to really remember our values about why we did this, that this model was really intentional on how we wanted to center Indigenous partners and local stewards for best practices. And I also had to step in and advocate strongly for Indigenous communities that I support, because they may not have been in line or agreed to who was coming to the table based on their values and relationships. And so, lastly, we had to look at, if we wanted to continue to grow the CIB model and also, weed out, corporate greenwashing, because we saw it as an emerging trend in the sector. We had to look at all of these considerations, and this led to a pivotal moment for us. And so for phase two, we loosely created like investor partnership criteria. And, keep in mind at that time, there wasn't a lot of frameworks that tie in accountability and specifically reconciliation, and so we had a tough time trying to create a framework that could do all that. And so we looked at what was out there, some things off the top of my mind, like the TRC, UNDRIP, Nature Conservancy's principles for corporate engagement, to name a few. But we really took our time with investors and outcome pairs to make sure that their values were aligned with everything that we were working for, and we were really happy and fortunate that we could create a relationship, for instance, with Dragonfly for phase two, but I think when we look at phase three, we're going to be doing some really deep and intentional work with Western University's Ivey Business School, and I'll be working with many Indigenous partners across the field and in the sector to really expand and solidify the criteria, which is in development now. And we also are going to look at among investors and in the sector, what the Indigenous-led conservation projects out there and how they tie, corporate reconciliation, and what that is going to look like. I think when we talk about meaningful partnerships, it's a fine line to walk when you're doing good and building those partnerships with Indigenous communities. But for us, it's the how you do it. You can either support them in the ways that they need, or you can cause harm. And so I think for the CIB, my role specifically is really critical, because I approach my work with having, that lived experience coming from the communities I'm engaging with. And so, I can go to the communities and I can ask them, what do you need? And go back to Carolyn in Canada and say, we need to do it like this. As the facilitator of the bond, we work with, the financial folks and engage them on reconciliation and what ethical space looks like in practice, and for this model and why we do it like that. Sometimes for them, it's a really big learning curve. But we feel it's critical to changing both the financial and the conservation sector on better ways to engage, develop, and implement some of this work in trust and partnership with Indigenous communities.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sam. And I know that the Conservation Impact Bond emphasizes this concept of ethical space, which you've shared with me is essential foundation for relationship building and adopting the two-eyed seeing approach that Adam also mentioned. Wondering if maybe you could just take a few moments to speak to that, and whether, based on your experience, if it's possible to maintain ethical space as we scale kind of the investment field in Canada.
Yeah, so let's talk about ethical space. It can be defined as intentional space dedicated to diverse collaboration rooted in the values of respect, empathy, trust, and desire to co-create mutual reciprocal outcomes between two or more partners. At Carolyn in Canada, we recognize that it must be an intentional and evolving practice, and that it must be co-created with responsibility and accountability. And lastly, that ethical space is the foundation of two-eyed seeing. So when you're creating this model, this this piece specifically took us the longest. In phase one, it was, more or less 2 years of relationship building and co-creating. In terms of my work, I've been relationship building with some of these communities and partners for, a little bit over 3 years. And, I always say that I like to move at the speed of trust, and that it takes time, it takes commitment, and it takes a lot of flexibility and willingness to do it right. This is why I think I get so passionate about the work that Indigenous communities are doing, because I get to spend time with them on the land. I get to listen to their hopes, their dreams. I get to meet the youth, and I see firsthand what they're fighting for and protecting for the future generations. I think in terms of scaling, holding ethical space, for me isn't an issue as long as you're dedicated to the principles of it. These are relationships you're nurturing, and not only with the communities, but also with the land. And that's what matters most. And I think as long as we center that and are willing to be intentional on how you do things, you can do it in a good way. And with Indigenous folks, leading, and, Indigenous partners leading, they'll tell you how to go about things in a certain way. I think it's just really up to, the partners to be really willing to listen and adapt.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And we had the joy of being together a couple of weeks ago on the sidelines of the Sustainable Finance Forum, and we got to chat about that a lot more. And so thank you for imparting that. Adam, maybe if I can come to you, we've talked a little bit about how philanthropic funding is one way to support nations undertake feasibility studies and build the capacity necessary to get a project, quote unquote, investment ready. However, private investors can sometimes then be sitting on the sidelines waiting. Are there types of blended finance models or other incentives that you would encourage private investors to get involved sooner, or that would enable private investors to get involved a little bit sooner in the process, especially recognizing that important relational work that kind of precedes the opportunity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe let me first talk about what blended financing is in case folks are less familiar with it. So when we think about blended finance, it's an investment strategy that combines public, philanthropic, and private capital designed to be able to reduce risk and make these kinds of projects or opportunities more attractive to private investors. And so trying to leverage concessional funds to bring in more private capital to sectors or regions that would otherwise lack access to these kinds of financial resources. And so one example might be federal government and a philanthropic foundation can provide first loss capital to an affordable housing fund for rural Canada that then brings in or attracts other private investors to address the rural housing shortage while still delivering some form of financial return. Then we think, and I think a whole host of folks think, including all those on the panel, there's many ways that holders of capital, again, that have philanthropic and private resources, can incentivize or de-risk these kinds of opportunities and bring in more funding or capital. One is technical assistance and grants for design funding or operating these kinds of high impact initiatives. And so it may be a grant, for example, to support the design and operation of the Carolinian Canada Conservation Impact Bond, which is critical to be able to catalyze or activate and operate these kinds of structures. The other is applying outcomes funding or financing, where you are providing capital or funding at the end to be able to cover the costs and capital investors are putting up front. Other ways that folks can come in, maybe things like guarantees, where they are guaranteeing at a very low cost the investment capital that's coming in, unlocking the ability again of organizations like Carolinian or White Feather to be able to bring in and leverage more private capital. There may also be ways of navigating or creating what's called a capital stack, or the different layers of funding within a capital pool, where you may have more senior or junior positions and guarantees and otherwise, to again make that more attractive and allow folks to fit in where their risk profile fits best, but otherwise crowding or bringing in the collection of resources, including philanthropy, including kind of concessionary capital, as well as more traditional return-seeking capital to be able to finance or fund, private equity alongside debt, alongside grants for things like the $15 to $30 million that White Feather may need, or the $2 million that the collection of partners could need for the conservation impact bond. Now, if we can also layer that, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later, other incentives or regulatory mandates to be able to, in an incremental way, from government's perspective, provide a little bit of resources to encourage folks to invest, or have some capital requirement mandates around the collective necessity of investing and providing capital in this particular way. But I'll look forward to that conversation a little bit later.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And that's a great teaser for a question that's coming up. Stephen, I see you're coming into the conversation. Did you have a contribution that you'd like to add at this point in time? Oh, but you'll have to come off mute. Thanks.
Thank you. We have to say that at least once in every webinar and Zoom meetings. In the early days, we've engaged with a lot of corporations looking for investors to support the feasibility work that's required to get a nature-based solutions project to market. There's not an appetite out there, but that's a key area of investment that's very lacking. That's it. That's where Indigenous governments are declaring an area within their territory, within the provincial or territorial environment. Those territorial and provincial governments have the administrative responsibility for all public and crown lands in Canada. Doing the feasibility study gets the project to investment stage, but more importantly, it allows the nations to use the data to validate their IPCAs. They could demonstrate that the IPCA is not an economic black hole that the province needs to worry about. In fact, it could be an economic contributor to the GDP of the province and reducing the burden on the social envelopes of their tax base. So it's very important to understand where some of these contributions could go and should go. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. And I love the fluidity of this conversation and the way it's unfolding. Carolyn, I saw you nodding quite vigorously as Adam was explaining, all of those opportunities and different models to stack capital, to have blended finance models. Wondering what your experience has been and if there's any kind of contribution to that conversation that you'd like to add at this point.
Yeah, so in addition to those tools, I'd say at a bit of a more 30,000 foot perspective is I think that it's a bit of an undeveloped story for more mainstream financial institutions and the standard way that we look at capitalism. So there's, I think, in short, a lot of unlearning to do, and also integration of language. I think that the first 30 by 30 nomenclature development approach is really interesting because it is trying to integrate different ways of thinking, and language is a really important tool. And then my other bit is that I was resonating with me also when Stephen was talking, and then again earlier with Sam's comments, is for philanthropic funders coming in at different stages is really compelling, because every philanthropic organization has different criteria and ways of showing up. Is that the close? Is that early stage? Is that silently? Is that more out in visible partnership? And so I think that it can look like many different things, but relationship and consent is a really important part of however that looks. So for example, in how we've been supporting the Kekatani Inuit with their PFP is through like a vetting process. Are we able to show up? How do we show up over time? And I think that and then I'm also going to drop in the chat like a bit of an unlearning space for philanthropic partners. Again, I think there's a little bit of learning for other types of capital with an organization called the Right Relations Collaborative, which asks you to reshift power for good, like to build better relationships. So I think everybody needs to do some of that internal work, no matter who you are, to make sure that how you're showing up in the capital that you could bring into these initiatives is flowing in a helpful way and is defined in a way that's meaningful to your organization, of course, but also works in the full sort of spectrum so that, and this is a bit of a cliche, but the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, and harm is not being perpetuated, because we're talking about money here, and money and power have a lot of that embedded in it. Yeah, so anyway, I think that might be an interesting segue to really dig into some of the first 30 by 30 tools.
Thanks for that, Carolyn. I might pivot us back to Thea for a moment, because I think you sit in this really interesting space. And for any other kind of corporate philanthropy folks on the line, you know, there's an opportunity to lay the groundwork and foster the relationships that can then be linked up to other parts of the business to deepen the relationship and leverage kind of mutual objectives. So I'm wondering if you can unpack for the audience and share what that might look like in practice from an RBC perspective.
Sure. And obviously, we're a company whose core business is not philanthropy. We're a foundation and a philanthropic entity within a large corporation, even though the philanthropy is the core focus of my work. So while I feel strongly that our philanthropy must stand alone and be driven by, directly by the intended social or environmental outcomes of the work, we also do want to leverage across the other lines, the other parts of our business, where there might be expertise, guidance, advice, business opportunities, but only where it makes sense and benefits both parties. So it's not a condition, it is not a requirement. But the broader relationships and connections might provide value or be win-win on both sides. So that's something that we like to explore and facilitate. And I'll give an example initially unrelated to IPCA work. We have a long-standing community investment partnership with the Mars Discovery District that some folks might know here in Toronto. It's sort of a hub for clean tech and innovation. And we support the Women in Clean Tech Accelerator, which guides often young women entrepreneurs to advance their breakthrough ideas to market-ready solutions. And products. And our grant, our philanthropic support, supports the capacity building, the strategy of the program that provides that support to the entrepreneurs. It does not support the ventures themselves. However, there's also a relationship that formed with RBCX, which is RBC's clean tech arm that provides networking and mentoring opportunities. There's potential exposure to our venture capital and private equity group that's investing in clean tech solutions, and potential connections with our enterprise strategic client group that deals with impact investing and philanthropic interests of family offices, for example. So we've facilitated some of those relationships. And in projects like the first 30 by 30, as I mentioned earlier, it was the initial connection with our environmental market solutions group and the potential around carbon markets that first sort of started our dialogue. And I think there was some advice in that regard. And as the carbon element of the projects mature, if there is interest in connecting the dots and having dialogue, we'll facilitate that. We also have RBC Origins, which is our Indigenous banking group and our reconciliation office, and there could be connections there. Likewise, there could be connections to our enterprise strategic client group, and individual philanthropists or family offices that are interested in impact investing. So it's all to say where there's benefit in exploring relationships across the bank, catalyzed by our philanthropy. And that is driven by the desire of the projects being, the organizations and the projects that we're supporting, then we help to build and facilitate those relationships.
Yeah, thanks for that, Thea. And I appreciate the work that you're doing to think through how do you kind of break down the silos that get built up within big institutions in order to leverage good across that. I'm mindful of our time together, and so I might ask for a rapid fire response from each of you to this next question, which was the one that Adam teased. So just wondering, is there one thing that if done or thought about differently could make a significant impact on the flow of philanthropic and private capital into Indigenous-led conservation in Canada? And rapid fire starting Sam, Adam, Thea, and then Carolyn.
Sure. Okay, so I think when we look at philanthropic and, in the private sector, something that I've noticed is that many want to work with Indigenous partners for reconciliation, but like when you look at the, the EOI or the grant or the investment opportunity, it can be a very narrow and limited scope and sometimes completely out of touch with what Indigenous communities actually need because it's based on colonial standards of conservation. And sometimes there isn't a willingness to open up the conversation to redirect the funding to what communities share are their priorities. And I think this needs to change. They need flexibility woven into the opportunities because, they know what's best for the land. And, also on the other side, for investors is, again, reframing this colonial narrative around risk, especially when you look at Indigenous-led conservation. Trusting us to lead is the key because we have proven best practices and stronger environmental outcomes in terms of conservation time and time again. At this point in the climate emergency, it's a risk not to be investing. We have to restore over 30% of landscapes to mitigate climate change. But really, I think we need 50% to build climate resiliency, and Indigenous-led projects are best positioned to do this. Thank you.
We're going rapid fire, so I'm happy, Courtney, to go next real quick. And that was great, Sam. Maybe a couple of things, and I'll try to be brief on them. One is, I think we could imagine the creation of a collaboratively financed catalytic capital or blended financing pool, which had flexible capital, could be used as grants, could be used as guarantees, it could be used as otherwise concessionary capital, or even technical assistance to be able to incentivize private investments into these kinds of opportunities. There is a tradition of collaboration within our philanthropic environment in Canada. Let's imagine what we could do to create a larger pool for that purpose. Second, I'm sorry to do two, but I'll be really fast, is can we imagine some sort of regulatory mandates? Could be small, but would still be catalytic, like the Community Reinvestment Act in the US. It requires and mandates large financial institutions and asset owners, they reinvest back in the community. In this case, not only could we imagine them investing in businesses and organizations and communities, but also in conservation and with and within Indigenous communities. And that would not require additional resources. We have those at our disposal, but it would allow financial institutions to be able to place some of their capital or designate it for this particular purpose.
I think I'm next. And we never just have one thing. And I'll echo some of what folks have already said. And this might not be unique to us, but I think for us, it's been really important to not just look at sort of what we fund, but who we fund and how, and to start to understand that outcomes will look different and be more diversified, and projects will proceed at different phases than we might have quote unquote normally thought of when we thought of our the conservation work in terms of acres and species. That we have to have a whole mind shift in how we look at our investment in nature-based solutions and really lean into who is best positioned to lead and drive the work, even if that's new to us. And I think for all of us, there's an internal education to be done, not just on learning more about the Indigenous-led conservation, but before involvement with 30 by 30 and even me coming in with my background, we weren't familiar with the 30 by 30 target, with We Rise Together, the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. None of this was really known or centered in our thinking. So we're on a big learning journey, but our hope is that that's, it's changing and driving a new approach. And then the last thing I just want to mention, because this was really valuable to helping us start along this learning journey, as we were looking at our new community investment approach, we hired Indigenous philanthropy advisors to really work with us, recognizing we're a big institution and a big institutional funder, but to work with us to develop our approach from how we ask questions and applications, the mindset that we start to look at outcomes and evaluation and the whole process that we undertake and start us on that journey.
Well, you heard me go on a little bit about the capitalist system full stop. So I think my big hope is that if we center abundance, then there accordingly will be a cascade in the flow of capital and tools to, I guess, de-silo some of these walls that are in these sectors and between these people that inhibit just good work and relationships, actually. So if we can center abundance, we will I think accordingly see change. More specifically, as Adam kind of alluded to, I would love for the institutional investment space to examine the tool of a PRI or MRI, program-related investments or mission-related investments, because I think it's a really underused tool. And it could be a way to learn more and flow capital outside of more conventional and I arguably maybe a little less helpful spaces into some of the really interesting communities and places that we've talked about today.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn. And maybe if you want to stay off mute with me for a moment as we wrap this conversation up, would love to just have each of you in a minute or so share what success looks like to you in terms of the future state of philanthropic and private capital playing a role in scaling Indigenous-led efforts across Canada. So we'll do it a little bit backwards. Carolyn, Thea, Adam, and then Sam.
Thanks. Well, as I started, I think success looks like something very different, and it's a community-defined thing. So that would sort of be my quick answer, and I would love to know what those communities would define as success. And it's, of course, success also looks like what I just said, which is abundance. Thank you so much.
I think, yeah, hard to say more than that. It's abundance. It is hard for us to define. I think from our perspective internally, I'm hoping that aligned with our reconciliation action plan, we're investing more money where we're invited to into this type of work. And we learn that our philanthropy has been catalytic in opening up other opportunities, and whether it's the first 30 by 30 or other Indigenous-led projects, when those with whom we are supporting sort of reflect on their experience with us and the funding we provided and how we provided it, that it was done in reciprocity and met their needs, and that right across philanthropy that we are providing flexible funding at the right time to advance this work.
I think in terms of success, a few things. One is that of new capital mobilized from new and existing actors is critical. So we're seeing more resources come in. I think there's more regenerative and indigenous ways of knowing, as well as practices of conservation, business, and governance. And then demonstrable impact in terms of the natural environment, the relations that we have between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And ultimately the protection of our natural ecosystems and lands. So if we can create that kind of world together, I think that would be incredibly exciting and impactful.
I think for me and my work, I would like to see the barriers taken down for Indigenous communities and Indigenous organizations in terms of access to capital from the philanthropic and private sector. I kind of wish it wasn't so hard for them in a colonial world where we always have to prove ourselves capable through all these processes. And, I think they should really just trust us to do what we do best. I think for Indigenous communities leading the work, I want to see them thriving on the land. I want to see healthy and restored lands being used for traditional practices and for further protected for time immemorial. The private sector can help us, but the way this needs to happen must be informed by better practices that many of my colleagues have talked here today. And I hope you really listen. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam. I knew you would end us on a really good note. So I want to say thank you, Sam, Thea, Carolyn, Adam, for gifting us your time this afternoon, this morning, wherever folks are joining us from. That has been a really incredible conversation that I hope we can just kind of pick up and keep building on and coming together around in the future. So Stephen, I'm so glad you're joining me back on as we close out this session. Appreciate everyone on the line who has taken time to join us live and listen in. And for anyone who is watching this as a recording, in terms of next steps, as mentioned at the start, we will be following up to share this recording with you in case you would like to revisit it or share it with others. Included in that email will also be a short survey because we would love to know, what you would have liked to learn more about, if there are any other kind of questions that are percolating after we close down this conversation today, as well as an initial set of responses to some of the questions that have been coming up through the Q&A box. So thank you everyone who has been putting them in there. Certainly, on behalf of the Nature Investment Hub team, I invite you to reach out to learn more about the work that we are doing to advance practical, collaborative action, active solutions to scale conservation finance in Canada, and consider joining the growing network that we are creating by becoming a partner. And I will ask Michael, colleague, to drop my contact information in the chat. And we'll turn it over to Stephen. And as I do, I just want to acknowledge that, while there were a few folks from the Nature Investment Hub and First 30 by 30 team on the screen today, there were a number of them working behind the scenes to make this function. So I want to say thank you to them as well. And then I will turn things over to Stephen.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for all those that are doing their thing behind the scenes to make this a successful webinar. Canada has a huge role to play globally when it comes to addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. To reach 30% in Canada, we still need 1.5 million square kilometers protected or conserved terrestrially, and the same amount of quantum of land or quantum of water for the marine protected areas. We have the space to manage for abundance. We have the capacity to lead by examples and really inform and impact the global marketplace that are created to support our collective effort to address climate change and biodiversity loss. Indigenous peoples in Canada are leading the way by declaring and protecting conserved areas as an exercise of land-back reconciliation to some degree. There's 1.5 million square kilometers in Canada on terrestrial land. So every Indigenous community in this country can create its own protected and conserved areas that's going to be special to them, that can contribute to the quantum, that can be managing high concentration of carbon sinks and very important ecosystems of biodiversity. That's the opportunity in front of us. There's over 70 IPCAs declared. There's lots of projects to be invested in. And it's an investment not only in conservation, but it's an investment in the Canadian economy, because these are economic development activities as well. And we could create economies at scale based on conservation and our global responsibility in Canada in places that are very difficult to create economies of scale. I used to be a chief when I used to be an MLA in public governments. So I understand the challenges of financial restraints. Places like my community of Fusagé, if it's not resource development, there's no economy. There's places like that's isolated, that has ecological interconnectedness that can provide a service not only to the region, the province, to the global community. And we could play a leadership role here in Canada to start managing for abundance and invest in projects like the Carolinian project that Samantha is leading. There's many projects like that. So I thank you for your considerations and your participations. Masicho, have a great day.